In the heart of the 16th century, the Howard family stood as a pillar of English nobility, their ambitions etched into the cold stone of history. Catherine Howard, a mere girl of 15, was the niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. Raised in the sprawling, loosely governed household of the Dowager Duchess, Catherine grew up in a world where surveillance was lax and youthful indiscretions were whispered behind heavy tapestries. She was a vibrant, spirited blossom in a garden of thorns, unaware that her family's thirst for power would soon transform her into a pawn in the king's dangerous game of courtly politics. At Horsham and Lambeth, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk oversaw a chaotic dormitory filled with young noblewomen. Far from the watchful eyes of strict tutors, the atmosphere was one of clandestine freedom. In the flickering candlelight of the girls' sleeping quarters, Catherine Howard discovered the intoxicating power of her own beauty. The dormitory was a place of shared secrets and midnight laughter, where the boundaries of propriety were often blurred. Here, Catherine's lack of a formal education was replaced by a dangerous social education, as she learned the art of flirtation and the thrill of forbidden attention among her peers. Amidst the shadows of the Duchess's household, Catherine's first romantic entanglement began with Henry Mannix, her music teacher. However, it was Francis Dereham, a young gentleman in the Duchess's service, who would claim a more significant piece of her heart. They exchanged gifts and promises in the dark corners of the manor, a secret world of passion that felt far removed from the dictates of the crown. Dereham referred to Catherine as his wife, and she, in her youthful naivety, believed their bond was unbreakable. This secret past, hidden behind heavy oak doors, would later become the very foundation of her tragic undoing. While Catherine navigated her private romances, her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was watching the political winds shift. King Henry VIII's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves was a diplomatic disaster. The king found his new bride physically repulsive. Norfolk saw an opportunity to restore the Howard family's influence at court by placing his beautiful niece in the king's path. Catherine was summoned from the country to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the new queen. She was a fresh face in a court weary of political strife, a sacrificial lamb dressed in the finest silks the Howard fortune could provide. The Tudor court was a place of shimmering gold and lethal secrets. As a lady-in-waiting, Catherine was thrust into the center of this world. She moved through the corridors of Hampton Court, her youthful energy a stark contrast to the aging, ailing king. Henry VIII, plagued by a festering leg wound and the bitterness of his failed marriages, was immediately captivated by the young girl. To him, Catherine represented a return to his own youth, a rose without a thorn. The Howards encouraged the king's interest, coaching Catherine on how to charm the most powerful and dangerous man in England. The king's infatuation grew rapidly. He showered Catherine with expensive jewels and land grants, treating her with a tenderness he hadn't shown in years. In the eyes of the court, Catherine was a breath of fresh air, a symbol of hope for a king who had become increasingly mercurial and prone to bouts of rage. However, beneath the surface of the royal favor lay the heavy weight of expectation. Catherine was expected to provide the king with more sons and to remain a paragon of virtue, a standard that her secret past at the Duchess's household would make impossible to maintain. In July 1540, the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was officially annulled. On the very same day that his former advisor, Thomas Cromwell, was executed, Henry married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. Catherine was now the Queen of England, a position of unimaginable power and peril. She was 16 years old, married to a man nearly 30 years her senior. The Howard family had achieved their goal, But the foundation of Catherine's throne was built on the shifting sands of her teenage secrets and the king's fragile ego, making her reign a ticking clock. Catherine's reign was characterized by a youthful exuberance that the king found intoxicating. She brought music, dancing, and laughter back to the court, and for a brief moment, Henry seemed truly happy. He doted on his young wife, calling her his jewel. Yet the responsibilities of being queen were immense. Catherine was surrounded by enemies who envied her rise and by friends from her past who sought to capitalize on her new position. Among them was Thomas Culpeper, a distant cousin and a favorite gentleman of the king's privy chamber, whose presence would soon ignite a spark of dangerous desire. Despite her new status, Catherine found the aging king's company increasingly difficult. Henry was often in pain, and the physical demands of their marriage were a source of distress for the teenage queen. Her eyes began to wander toward the younger, more vibrant men of the court. Thomas Culpeper, known for his handsome looks and reckless nature, became the object of her affection. Their secret meetings were facilitated by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, the Lady Rochford. In the shadows of the royal palaces, Catherine began a high-stakes affair that threatened to bring the entire Howard dynasty crashing down into the dust of treason. As the queen's indiscretions grew more frequent, the whispers at court intensified. Catherine, perhaps blinded by her youth and the thrill of her secret romance, failed to realize how precarious her position truly was. Every letter she sent to Culpeper and every secret meeting she held was a step closer to the scaffold. The ghosts of her past, including Francis Dereham, were also returning to haunt her, as they sought positions in her royal household based on their former intimacy. The Howard family's triumph was rapidly turning into a nightmare as the dark secrets of Catherine's youth began to surface in the light. The shadows of Catherine's past manifested in the form of Francis Dereham, her former lover from the Duchess of Norfolk's household. Bold and reckless, Dereham arrived at the royal court, not as a humble subject, but as a man demanding his due. He leveraged his previous intimacy with the Queen to secure a position as her private secretary, a move of staggering arrogance. Catherine, trapped by the fear of exposure, felt compelled to grant his request. His presence was a ticking time bomb, a physical reminder of the pre-contract that could annul her marriage and destroy her future if the king ever discovered the truth. While the court celebrated All Saints' Day, a storm was brewing in the silence of the chapel. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man of cautious intellect and reformist leanings, received an anonymous note detailing the Queen's scandalous history. The document spoke of her unchaste life before the king, specifically naming Dereham and Manox. Cranmer, well aware of the Howard family's influence and the king's volatile temper, realized the gravity of this information. To speak was to risk his life. To remain silent was treason. The weight of the evidence left him with little choice but to initiate a clandestine investigation into the Queen's virtue. The investigation began in the dead of night, far from the prying eyes of the king's inner circle. Cranmer's agents moved like ghosts through the palace, gathering the women who had served in the Duchess of Norfolk's household. These witnesses, terrified of being implicated in the Queen's downfall, began to whisper the secrets they had kept for years. They described the late-night visits, the gifts exchanged, and the promises made in the dark corners of Lambeth Palace. Each testimony was a thread in a tightening noose, painting a picture of a young girl whose past was far from the virginal ideal Henry VIII demanded. On November 2nd, 1541, the world of Catherine Howard shattered. During the morning mass, Cranmer approached the king, but his courage failed him in person. Instead, he slipped a written summary of the accusations into Henry's hand. Pleading with him, to read it in private. Henry, initially annoyed by the interruption of his prayers, eventually retreated to his study. He loved Catherine with a blind, aging passion, and his first reaction to the letter was not fury at his wife, but a burning rage at the messengers. He believed it was a malicious fabrication designed to ruin his rose without a thorn. Despite his disbelief, Henry could not ignore the specific details provided in the report. He ordered a secret inquiry, demanding that the truth be unearthed at any cost. He desperately hoped the investigation would clear Catherine's name, allowing him to return to his blissful ignorance. However, as the Lords of the Council began their work, the evidence became insurmountable. Francis Dereham was arrested and brought to the Tower, where the threat of the rack loosened his tongue. He confessed to his past intimacy with the Queen, claiming they were as good as married, a confession that turned Henry's love into a cold, vengeful hatred. Back at Hampton Court, Catherine was confined to her apartments. The vibrant life she had brought to the palace was extinguished, replaced by a suffocating silence. She was stripped of her jewelry, and her royal attendants were replaced by stern-faced guards. Catherine, now a prisoner in her own home, was prone to fits of hysteria, her cries echoing through the corridors. She realized too late that her youthful dalliances and her more recent affair with Thomas Culpeper had converged to destroy her. The king, refusing to see her, moved to another palace, leaving her to face the council's relentless questioning alone. The council's reach expanded as they arrested Thomas Culpeper. Under interrogation, the charismatic courtier's bravado crumbled. Though he initially denied any wrongdoing, the discovery of a highly incriminating letter written in Catherine's own hand sealed his fate. In the letter, she expressed her desperate longing for him, ending with the fatal words, "Yours as long as life endures." This was the final proof of adultery, while Queen, a crime of high treason. The revelation devastated the king, who wept openly before his council, mourning the betrayal of the woman he had called his perfect jewel. The Howard family, once the architects of Catherine's rise, now scrambled to distance themselves from her. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, was among the first to denounce her, calling her a vile wretch to save his own head. The court was in a state of shock as the full extent of the Queen's loose living was broadcast to the public. The investigation revealed a network of complicity among her ladies-in-waiting, including the Lady Rochford, who had facilitated the secret meetings with Culpeper. The scandal was no longer just about Catherine. It was a purge of the Queen's entire inner circle. As the evidence mounted, the legal machinery of the Tudor state ground forward. Catherine was formally stripped of her title as Queen. She was no longer the sovereign lady of England, but merely Catherine Howard, the king's guilty subject. The psychological toll was immense. She vacillated between periods of catatonic silence and frantic attempts to plead for mercy. She sent messages to the king, begging for a chance to explain, but Henry remained unreachable, his heart hardened by the humiliation she had brought upon his crown. The scaffold was no longer a distant threat, but an approaching certainty. In December 1541, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were executed at Tyburn. Culpeper, due to his status, was granted the mercy of beheading, while Dereham suffered the full brutality of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their deaths were a grim prelude to Catherine's own fate. She remained at Sion House, a former convent, awaiting the act of attainder that would condemn her without a trial. The young queen, who had once danced through the halls of the palace, now walked the corridors of her prison, listening to the tolling bells and contemplating the sharp edge of the executioner's axe. By January 1542, The legal machinery of the Tudor state ground forward with cold precision. Parliament introduced the Bill of Attainder, a ruthless legislative shortcut that bypassed a standard trial and guaranteed a death sentence. The Lords and Commons debated a new, specific clause. It was now high treason for any woman who was not a virgin to marry the king without first disclosing her unchaste past. This law, crafted specifically to ensnare the teenage queen, was applied retroactively. The parchment, heavy with the weight of her impending doom, moved through the chambers, sealed with the chilling authority of a monarch who felt personally betrayed. At Greenwich Palace, King Henry VIII sat in isolated fury, his leg ulcer throbbing with a pain that mirrored his wounded ego. The once glamorous king was now a shadow of his youth, bloated by excess and bitterness. When the Bill of Attainder was presented for his signature, he did not hesitate. His hand, adorned with heavy gold rings, gripped the quill with a vengeful strength. As the ink stained the vellum, the last hope for Catherine's mercy evaporated. He would not see her again. He would only see her name erased from the history of his reign, replaced by the mark of a traitor. On February 10th, the quiet of Sion House was shattered by the arrival of the king's commissioners. They entered the queen's private chambers, not with the customary bows of loyalty, but with the cold efficiency of jailers. Catherine was formally notified that the Act of Attainder had been signed and that her execution was scheduled for the morning of February 13th. The news struck the 19-year-old like a physical blow. The walls of her temporary prison seemed to close in, the once holy sanctuary of the former convent now feeling like a tomb where the silence was only broken by the weeping of her ladies. The journey from Sion House to the Tower of London was a somber procession down the River Thames. Catherine was placed in a closed barge, shielded from the eyes of the public, yet she could hear the rhythmic splash of the oars and the distant murmurs of the city. The winter fog clung to the water, obscuring the familiar landmarks of her brief, glittering life as queen. Every stroke of the oars brought her closer to the fortress that had claimed the life of her cousin, Anne Boleyn, only 6 years prior. The river, usually a place of royal pageantry, now felt like a cold, gray road to the scaffold. As the barge approached the tower, the looming silhouette of Traitor's Gate emerged from the gloom. This was the entrance reserved for those who had fallen from the king's highest graces. The heavy iron portcullis creaked open, a sound like a dying animal echoing off the damp stone walls. Catherine looked up at the water lane, where the dampness of the river seeped into the very foundations of the prison. As she stepped onto the stone stairs, the transition from queen to condemned prisoner was complete. The gate closed behind her with a final, heavy thud, sealing her fate within the ancient walls. Inside her cell in the tower, Catherine's fear took a strange and practical turn. Aware that her end was near, she made a final, haunting request. She asked that the executioner's block be brought to her room. She wished to practice how to lay her head upon it, fearing that in her final moments she might stumble or lack the dignity expected of a queen. In the dim light of her chamber, she knelt repeatedly before the wooden block, feeling the cold grain against her neck. It was a macabre rehearsal, a young girl trying to master the art of dying before the world's unforgiving gaze. The night of February 12th was the longest of Catherine's life. She spent her final hours in prayer and reflection, attended by a few loyal servants who remained. The opulence of the court, the silk gowns, the jewels, the whispered flirtations in the corridors of Hampton Court, now seemed like a fever dream from another lifetime. She was no longer the rose without a thorn that Henry had once praised. She was a terrified teenager facing the absolute power of the Tudor crown. In the silence of the tower, she wrote her final letters. her quill scratching against the parchment in the rhythm of a heartbeat she knew would soon stop. Monday, February 13th, 1542, dawned cold and gray over London. At 7 in the morning, the heavy doors of the Queen's lodgings opened. Catherine emerged, dressed in a gown of black velvet, her face pale but composed. Beside her was Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had been her confidant and was now her companion in death. They walked toward Tower Green, where a small private scaffold had been erected. A modest crowd of officials and witnesses stood in the biting wind, their breaths visible in the air. The solemn tolling of a bell marked each step of her final walk toward the wooden stage. Ascending the steps of the scaffold, Catherine addressed the small gathering. Her voice, though small, was steady. She acknowledged her sins, though she maintained she had never been unfaithful to the king after their marriage. A distinction that mattered little to the law, but everything to her soul. Legend claims her final words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether true or a later romantic invention, the sentiment captured the tragedy of a girl caught in a game of thrones she never truly understood. She asked the executioner for forgiveness, and he knelt before her in the traditional custom. The moment of finality arrived. Catherine knelt and laid her head upon the block she had practiced with just hours before. The crowd fell into a deathly silence, the only sound the rustle of the wind and the distant caw of the tower ravens. The executioner raised his heavy axe, the steel glinting coldly in the morning light. In one swift, brutal stroke, the life of the fifth wife of Henry VIII was ended. Catherine Howard, the teenage queen who had sought love in a dangerous court, was gone. Her body was hastily carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, to be buried in an unmarked grave near her cousin Anne. The Tower Green was left in a haunting stillness after the crowd dispersed. The executioner cleaned his blade, a grim necessity of his trade. Blood-soaked straw was swept away, but the memory of the young queen's screams lingered in the damp air. Inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the stone floor was pried open to receive her remains. She was laid to rest without the pomp and ceremony of a queen, placed near her cousin Anne Boleyn. The echoes of her short life faded into the cold masonry of the fortress, marking the end of her tragic journey. At Hampton Court, the king received the final report of the execution. Henry VIII, now a bloated shadow of the athletic prince he once was, sat in his private chambers, surrounded by the finery of his office. The news of Catherine's death did not bring him the peace he sought. Instead, it fueled a dark melancholy that would define his final years. He forbade anyone to speak her name, attempting to purge the rose without a thorn from the official records of England. The halls that once rang with Catherine's laughter were now silent, filled only with the flicker of dying candles. The Howard family, once the most powerful dynasty in the realm, scrambled to survive the fallout of Catherine's disgrace. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, wrote scathing letters to the king, denouncing his own niece to save his neck. He painted her as a manipulator who had deceived them all, a cold calculation typical of the Tudor court's cutthroat politics. Despite his desperate efforts, the family's influence was shattered. The Howard name, once synonymous with royal favor, now carried the stench of treason and the shadow of the axe, leaving them in political exile. Catherine was not the only victim of the king's wrath. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham had already met their gruesome ends at Tyburn, their heads displayed on London Bridge as a warning to all. Lady Jane Rochford, who had facilitated the secret meetings, followed Catherine to the block shortly after. She died with a plea for mercy on her lips, her mind reportedly broken by the weeks of interrogation. The machinery of Tudor justice was relentless, grinding anyone associated with the Queen's perceived infidelity into the dust of history, leaving a trail of broken lives in its wake. The court entered a period of stifling paranoia. Every whisper was scrutinized. Every glance could be interpreted as treason. The ladies-in-waiting who had served Catherine were questioned and dismissed, their futures ruined by their proximity to the fallen queen. The lavish tapestries and golden ornaments of the palace seemed to lose their luster, replaced by a cold, pervasive dread. The rose without a thorn had been plucked and discarded, leaving the court to navigate the thorns of a king whose heart had turned to stone, creating a climate where no one felt safe. Henry's health continued to fail, his leg ulcer causing him constant agony that no physician could soothe. He retreated further into his private apartments, surrounding himself with a dwindling circle of trusted advisors. The ghost of Catherine Howard and the ghosts of the wives before her seemed to haunt the corridors of his mind. He became increasingly erratic, swinging between bouts of religious fervor and explosive rage. The vibrant court of his youth was a distant memory, replaced by a somber fortress where the king sat as a prisoner of his own failing body and bitter regrets. Across the kingdom, portraits of Catherine were taken down and hidden or destroyed. Her coats of arms were chiseled off the walls of royal residences by stonemasons acting on the king's direct orders. It was as if Henry intended to rewrite history itself, removing every trace of the girl who had momentarily captivated him. In the archives, clerks scratched out her name from official documents, leaving jagged gaps in the parchment. This systematic erasure was a final act of vengeance, a way to ensure that the doomed teenage queen would be forgotten by the subjects she once ruled. Yet, history has a way of preserving what kings try to destroy. Catherine Howard's story survived through the letters of foreign ambassadors and the secret diaries of courtiers who witnessed her rise and fall. She was remembered not as a villain, but as a tragic figure. A girl caught in a game of power she was too young to play. Historians would later debate her guilt, questioning if she was a victim of her family's ambition or her own impulsive heart. Her short reign became a cautionary tale of the dangers inherent in the Tudor court. Today, the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula remains a place of pilgrimage for those moved by the Queen's fate. Beneath the altar, the remains of the two executed queens lie side by side in the silence of the vault. Legends speak of a white figure seen wandering the halls of the Tower of London, a restless spirit seeking the peace she was denied in life. Whether myth or memory, Catherine's presence is still felt in the cold stones of the tower. She remains the tragic rose, a symbol of innocence lost to the brutal machinery of the state. As the dust of Catherine's execution settled, the king's eyes turned once more toward the future of his dynasty. The political landscape of Europe was shifting, and Henry needed a stable presence by his side to manage his household. The search for a sixth wife would soon begin, leading to the rise of Catherine Parr. But the scars left by Catherine Howard's downfall would never fully heal. The Tudor dynasty was approaching its twilight, and the echoes of the young queen's tragedy would haunt the crown until the very end of Henry's long and bloody reign. The halls of Whitehall Palace felt hollow in the wake of Catherine Howard's execution. King Henry VIII, now a shadow of the vibrant monarch he once was, retreated into a world of physical pain and bitter reflection. His leg, plagued by a chronic ulcer, throbbed with a reminder of his mortality, while his mind replayed the perceived betrayals of his fifth wife. The court, once a place of revelry and youthful energy, became a somber theater of hushed whispers. The king's courtiers moved cautiously, fearing the mercurial temper of a man who had now sent 2 wives to the block. The Tudor sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the kingdom. In the months following the tragedy, Henry's isolation grew. The silence in the royal apartments was broken only by the scratching of quills on vellum, as advisors attempted to manage the king's darkening moods. He became obsessed with the legacy of his reign and the fragile state of his succession. The ghost of Catherine Howard seemed to linger in the tapestries, a reminder of the folly of his desire for a youthful queen. The king needed more than a wife. He needed a companion, a nurse, and a stable maternal figure for his 3 children. The romantic idealism of his youth had been replaced by a grim, pragmatic necessity. The Privy Council, led by the pragmatic Stephen Gardiner and the ambitious Thomas Wriothesley, began the delicate task of vetting candidates for the king's 6th marriage. They sought a woman of maturity, intellect, and unquestionable virtue to avoid the scandals that had destroyed Catherine Howard. The political stakes were high, as the factional divide between the religious conservatives and the reformists widened. Every potential candidate was scrutinized not for her beauty, but for her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the Tudor court. The council's meetings were held in candlelit rooms, where the fate of the next queen was decided in cold, calculated whispers. Amidst the search, the name of Catherine Parr emerged. A twice-widowed noblewoman of 31, Parr was known for her intelligence, piety, and calm demeanor. She was a woman of the new learning, deeply interested in religious reform, yet she possessed the social grace required to manage a temperamental king. Unlike the teenage Catherine Howard, Parr was seasoned by life and understood the gravity of the position offered to her. However, the king's interest was not initially met with joy. Parr was a woman with her own heart, and her heart had already been captured by someone else, the dashing Thomas Seymour. Catherine Parr found herself in a terrifying predicament. To refuse the king was to risk everything, yet she loved Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane. The two had shared secret glances and quiet promises before the king's gaze fell upon her. In the dark corners of the court, Parr wrestled with her conscience and her fear. She knew the history of Henry's wives, the annulments, the deaths, and the recent blood on the scaffold. She saw her duty to the crown as a divine calling, but the shadow of Catherine Howard's fate loomed over her like a death sentence. To survive, she would have to sacrifice her personal happiness. On July 12, 1543, in a private ceremony at Hampton Court, Catherine Parr became the 6th and final wife of King Henry VIII. There were no grand celebrations or public festivals this time. The mood was one of quiet solemnity. Henry, assisted by his servants to stand, looked on with a mixture of hope and weariness. For Catherine, it was a moment of profound transformation. She was no longer a widow seeking a quiet life, but the Queen of England, tasked with tending to a dying giant. The memory of Catherine Howard's vibrant, reckless youth seemed a world away from this somber union, as the Tudor court prepared for its final act. Catherine Parr's greatest achievement was the unification of the king's household. She acted as a bridge between Henry and his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Under her influence, the children were brought back to court and given the education and recognition they deserved. She was particularly close to the young Elizabeth, who had watched her own mother's downfall from afar. Parr's intellectual curiosity and religious devotion provided a stable environment that the Tudor children had lacked for years. However, her reformist views were dangerous, and the conservative factions at court watched her every move, waiting for the Queen to stumble as Howard had. Despite the domestic peace she cultivated, The atmosphere of the palace remained thick with the ghosts of the past. Catherine Parr often walked the same corridors where Catherine Howard had once run in frantic desperation. The tapestries seemed to hold the echoes of the young queen's screams, and the stone floors felt cold with the weight of history. Parr found solace in her writings and her faith, but she was acutely aware that the king's favor was a fickle thing. One wrong word on theology or politics could turn Henry against her. The shadow of the axe never truly vanished. It simply waited in the darkness for the next victim. The conservative faction, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, soon launched a campaign to destroy the new queen. They viewed Parr's Protestant sympathies as heresy and sought to convince the aging king that his wife was a danger to the spiritual health of the realm. They began to collect evidence, much as they had done against Catherine Howard, but this time the accusations were of the mind, not the flesh. Documents were signed, and a warrant for the queen's arrest was prepared. The palace became a labyrinth of traps and betrayals, as Parr fought for her life against enemies who moved in the shadows of the king's favor. As Henry VIII entered the final years of his reign, he was a man consumed by his own legend and his physical decay. He was a mountain of flesh, immobilized by his leg and his massive weight, yet his eyes still burned with a terrifying intensity. He was haunted by the memories of the wives he had loved and lost, and the blood he had shed to secure his throne. The tragedy of Catherine Howard remained a jagged scar on his soul, a reminder of a youth he could never reclaim. The king lay in his darkened chamber, the master of England, yet a prisoner of his own history, as the Tudor era prepared for its inevitable end. In the cold, damp corridors of Hampton Court, the memory of Catherine Howard lingered like a persistent chill. Henry VIII, now a shadow of the vibrant monarch he once was, spent his nights in a feverish state, his mind a battlefield of regret and betrayal. He could almost hear the echo of her laughter in the empty halls, a sound that once brought him joy, but now served as a piercing reminder of his own mortality. The king's physical frame continued to fail him, his leg ulcer causing constant agony, making every step a testament to his physical and spiritual decline. The court of England had become a place of whispers and veiled glances. The execution of a queen was a weight that suppressed the once boisterous atmosphere of the Tudor palace. Courtiers moved like ghosts through the galleries, fearful of drawing the king's ire or becoming the next target of a shifting political landscape. The silence was heavy, broken only by the scratching of quills as chroniclers recorded the king's increasingly erratic decrees. The vibrant rose without a thorn had been plucked and crushed, leaving behind a court that felt more like a tomb than a seat of power. Official records were meticulously altered. Scribes were tasked with erasing Catherine's influence from the royal archives, striking her name from ledgers and removing her heraldry from the walls. It was an attempt to delete a chapter of history that Henry found too painful to acknowledge. Yet the physical void she left was impossible to fill. The tapestries that once bore her initials were taken down, leaving bare stone that looked like open wounds in the palace's grand rooms. The erasure was thorough, but the psychological impact on the king and his inner circle remained as indelible as ink on vellum. Henry's obsession shifted toward his son and heir, Prince Edward. The boy represented the future, a way to move past the scandals of his wives. Henry watched the child with a mixture of pride and desperation, seeing in Edward the continuation of the Tudor bloodline that he had sacrificed so much to secure. However, even in the nursery, the ghosts of the past were present. The king's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, lived in the shadow of their fallen mothers, their very presence a reminder of the complex and often bloody path Henry had taken to achieve his dynastic goals. In a final attempt at stability, Henry married Catherine Parr. She was a woman of intellect and maturity, a stark contrast to the teenage impulsiveness of Catherine Howard. Parr acted as a nurse as much as a wife, tending to the king's rotting leg and his fractured spirit. She navigated the treacherous waters of the court with a wisdom that her predecessor lacked, managing to bridge the gap between Henry and his children. Yet, even as Parr provided a semblance of peace, the king's eyes would sometimes glaze over, lost in a memory of a younger, prettier face. The political factions within the court began to sharpen their knives as the king's health continued to fail. The Howard family, once so powerful through Catherine, now found themselves marginalized and under constant suspicion. Enemies of the family, particularly the Seymours, looked for any opportunity to eliminate their rivals. The air was thick with conspiracy and the scent of impending change. Every decree signed by the king was scrutinized for signs of weakness. The Tudor court had become a chessboard where the pieces were moved by fear and the desperate need to survive the king's final days. As night fell over London, the Tower remained a grim sentinel over the Thames. Within its walls, the legend of Catherine's final moments began to take on a life of its own. It was said that on certain nights, a pale figure could be seen retracing the steps to the executioner's block, her headless form a silent witness to the brutality of the era. These stories, whispered among guards and prisoners, added to the dark mythology of the Tudor reign. The tragedy of the teenage queen was no longer just a matter of state. It had become a haunting piece of English folklore. Among the king's private effects were the letters that had sealed Catherine's fate. He could not bring himself to destroy them, nor could he look at them without a surge of bile. The ink of Thomas Culpeper's words seemed to burn through the paper, a testament to a betrayal that Henry could never truly comprehend. These documents, stored in a locked chest, were the physical remnants of a love turned to ash. They represented the moment the king's heart had finally hardened beyond repair, turning his final years into a long, lonely march toward the inevitable grave. By January 1547, the king's end was near. He lay in a massive bed, his breathing labored and shallow. The room was filled with the smell of medicine and decay. He called for no one but his doctors and a few trusted advisors. In his final hours, the faces of his 6 wives likely flickered before his eyes: the loyal Catherine, the defiant Anne, the beloved Jane, the rejected Anne, the doomed Catherine, and the patient Catherine. The mountain of flesh that had ruled England with an iron will was finally being reclaimed by the earth, his legacy a complex web of blood and ambition. With the death of Henry VIII, the crown passed to his young son, Edward VI, but the shadows of the past did not dissipate. The daughters he had marginalized, Mary and Elizabeth, stood in the wings, their futures uncertain, but their spirits forged in the fire of their father's reign. The story of Catherine Howard remained a cautionary tale, a footnote in the grand, violent saga of the Tudors. As a new era dawned, the ghosts of the executed queens continued to haunt the corridors of power, their lives and deaths woven forever into the dark tapestry of the British monarchy. Under the fragile reign of the boy king, Edward VI, the court of England underwent a profound ideological shift. The opulence of Henry's final years was replaced by a rigid, somber Protestantism. Yet, beneath the surface of this new austerity, the memory of Catherine Howard lingered like a stain on the royal tapestry. The young king's advisors used her story as a moral tool, a dark warning against the perceived frivolity and sin that had supposedly led to the downfall of the teenage queen. In the corridors of Whitehall, her name was whispered in hushed, judgmental tones. her short life reduced to a theological lesson on the dangers of the flesh. For Mary Tudor, the ascent of her brother brought little comfort, but the memory of Catherine Howard provided a different kind of solace. Mary, a devout traditionalist, viewed the tragic queens of her father's reign through a lens of profound melancholy. She remembered Catherine not just as a predecessor, but as a victim of her father's volatile temper and the shifting sands of political favor. Mary's own survival had been a precarious dance, and in the quiet of her private chapel, she prayed for the souls of those who had fallen. To Mary, Catherine was a symbol of the chaos that had unraveled the moral fabric of the kingdom. Young Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, watched the world with a calculating eye that far exceeded her years. The execution of her cousin, Catherine Howard, had been a formative trauma. It served as a brutal confirmation that for a woman in the Tudor court, love was a liability, and marriage was often a death sentence. Elizabeth studied the patterns of Catherine's rise and fall, learning the vital necessity of emotional distance and political survival. She walked the same gardens where Catherine once laughed, her expression unreadable, her spirit forged into a shield against the vulnerability that had destroyed her kinswoman. The Tower of London remained the ultimate witness to Catherine's final chapter. Years after her death, the stones of the Beauchamp Tower and the soil of the Green held the memory of her footsteps. To those who worked within the fortress, the ghost of the frivolous queen was more than a legend. It was a lingering presence in the cold, damp air. Historical records from the era began to formalize the narrative of her guilt. Yet the physical reality of her imprisonment, the narrow cells and the sound of the axe, remained a visceral part of the tower's dark legacy. The teenage queen had become a permanent resident of England's most haunted monument. Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had played a pivotal role in Catherine's downfall, found himself navigating a world that was rapidly outgrowing his influence. Though he had been the one to deliver the initial accusations to Henry, the weight of the investigation and the subsequent executions weighed heavily on the religious climate. The trial of Catherine Howard had set a precedent for the use of moral transgression as a political weapon, a tool that would eventually be turned against the architects of the Reformation themselves. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by theological texts, Cranmer's role in the teenage queen's death remained a dark footnote in his complex legacy. The Howard family, once the most powerful faction at court, retreated into the shadows following Catherine's execution. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, survived by distancing himself from his niece's betrayal, but the stain on the family name was indelible. Their influence was shattered, their halls, once filled with music and laughter, now silent and suspicious. The Howards' fall illustrated the perilous nature of using young women as pawns in the Game of Thrones. They became a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong, their power stripped away by the very girl they had hoped would cement their legacy. As the mid-16th century progressed, the story of Catherine Howard began to morph from a scandal into a local legend. Servants at Hampton Court told stories of a screaming queen who could be heard in the haunted gallery, reliving her desperate plea for mercy to a king who would not listen. These myths were born from the collective trauma of a court that had witnessed the sudden and violent end of a girl barely out of childhood. The mystery of her true feelings and the extent of her crimes were buried beneath layers of folklore, ensuring that her presence would haunt the British monarchy for centuries to come. Historians and chroniclers of the era began to reevaluate the title Henry had bestowed upon Catherine, the Rose Without a Thorn. In the wake of her death, the nickname took on a cruel, ironic edge. The teenage queen, who had been celebrated for her beauty and youth, was now analyzed as a victim of a court that demanded perfection but offered no protection. The thorns were not within Catherine, but in the treacherous political landscape she had been forced to navigate. The documentary evidence of her life, letters, household accounts, and trial testimonies, painted a picture of a girl who was woefully unprepared for the crown. When Elizabeth I finally ascended the throne, the lessons of Catherine Howard were etched into her very soul. Elizabeth's refusal to marry and her careful cultivation of the Virgin Queen persona were direct responses to the fate of her father's wives. She understood that a husband was not just a partner, but a potential judge and executioner. By remaining single, Elizabeth reclaimed the power that had been stripped from Catherine. On her coronation day, as the crown was placed upon her head, the ghosts of the fallen queens, especially her cousin Catherine, stood as silent sentinels, their tragedies the foundation of her unprecedented strength. In the final analysis, Catherine Howard's life was a brief, tragic spark in the long, dark history of the British monarchy. She was a doomed teenage queen, a casualty of a patriarchal system and a king's fragile ego. Her story survives not as a tale of romance, but as a serious historical inquiry into the cost of power and the vulnerability of youth. As the shadows of the Tudor era stretched into the future, Catherine remained a symbol of the innocent lives consumed by the machinery of state. Her name, once shouted in condemnation, now invites a quiet, somber reflection on the nature of justice and memory. The Tower of London remains a silent witness to the final hours of Catherine Howard. Its cold, gray stone walls have absorbed the echoes of centuries of despair, yet her story stands out for its sheer brevity. At only 18 or 19, she was little more than a child, thrust into a world of predatory men and ruthless politics. The documentary record shows a girl who was poorly guarded and even more poorly guided. Today, as we look back through the lens of history, the fortress seems less like a prison and more like a tomb for lost innocence and wasted youth. The death warrant, signed with the heavy, trembling hand of an aging Henry VIII, serves as a grim testament to the absolute power of the Tudor monarchy. There was no room for mercy in a court defined by the king's fragile ego and his obsessive need for a pure queen. The ink on the parchment dried as her fate was sealed, bypassing a formal trial in favor of a bill of attainder. This legislative execution ensured that Catherine would have no platform to defend herself, no chance to plead for her life before the peers of the realm. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, shared Catherine's final journey to the scaffold. Her presence is one of the more enigmatic elements of the tragedy. Having survived the fall of Anne Boleyn, she found herself entangled once more in the deadly games of the Howard family. Some historians suggest she suffered a nervous breakdown under the pressure of the interrogation, yet the law was amended specifically to allow for the execution of the insane. Side by side, the two women faced the cold February morning, victims of a legal system redesigned by the Crown to ensure their absolute and total destruction. The Howard family, once the most powerful faction in England, scrambled to distance themselves from the niece they had used as a political pawn. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was quick to condemn Catherine to save his own neck. This betrayal highlights the ruthless nature of Tudor ambition, where blood ties were easily severed when they became a liability to one standing with the king. The family's rise and fall are etched into the history of the era, a stark reminder that in the shadow of the throne, loyalty was a fluid and dangerous currency for survival. The execution took place on the morning of February 13th, 1542. Witnesses noted that Catherine was so weak, she had to be helped onto the scaffold. In her final moments, she reportedly asked for the block to be brought to her cell the night before, so she could practice how to place her head. This haunting detail speaks to a young woman trying to find some shred of dignity in an undignified end. She died with a grace that surprised many who had previously dismissed her as flighty, proving her strength in the face of the ultimate terror. Following the execution, Henry VIII sought to erase Catherine from the collective memory of the court. Her portraits were destroyed, her jewels were redistributed, and her name was forbidden from being spoken in the king's presence. Henry retreated into a world of physical pain and psychological isolation, his leg ulcers festering as he grew increasingly paranoid. The void left by Catherine was filled with a bitter silence. This erasure was so effective that today, no undisputed portrait of the fifth queen exists, leaving her face a mystery to the ages she was briefly meant to rule. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula serves as the final resting place for the doomed queens. Catherine was buried beneath the floor, her remains mingled with those of her cousin Anne Boleyn. For centuries, her exact location was forgotten, a discarded footnote in the grand narrative of Henry's reign. It wasn't until the Victorian era, during renovations of the chapel, that the bones of these executed royals were rediscovered and reinterred with honor. This late recognition highlights the shifting perspectives on justice and the long road to acknowledging the tragedies of the past after centuries of silence. Modern historians view Catherine Howard not as a temptress or a traitor, but as a victim of her circumstances. Her lack of education and the lack of protection from her family made her an easy target for those seeking influence. The ancient British royal mystery of her life is solved not by finding a secret lover, but by understanding the systemic failures of the Tudor court. She was a teenager caught in a web of adult ambitions, her only crime being a desire for affection in a world that only valued her for her bloodline and her fertility. The legend of the Screaming Queen in Hampton Court's haunted gallery is perhaps the most enduring part of Catherine's legacy. It is said that her ghost runs through the hallway, pleading for the king's mercy. While such tales belong to folklore rather than fact, they reflect the cultural trauma of her sudden and violent removal. The image of the terrified girl seeking an audience with a silent, immovable king has become a powerful metaphor for the helplessness of the individual against the absolute state. Her scream echoes through time as a persistent cry for justice. In the final reflection, Catherine Howard's tragedy serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life at the center of power. Her story, though short, remains one of the most compelling chapters of the Tudor dynasty. It challenges us to look beyond the scandals and see the human being, the girl who wanted to be loved, and the queen who was never allowed to grow up. As the candle of the Tudor era eventually flickered out, the memory of the doomed teenage queen endured, a flickering light in the dark corridors of British history. The morning after the execution, an eerie silence descended upon the Palace of Whitehall. The vibrant tapestries and golden ornaments seemed to lose their luster, overshadowed by the grim reality of another queen's blood spilled. Catherine's chambers were sealed, her belongings inventoried like common property, and her ladies-in-waiting were dispersed into the shadows of the court. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of collective guilt and unspoken fear. In the king's private quarters, the air was heavy with the smell of burnt wax and old parchment, as if the very walls were trying to absorb the scandal and bury it forever. Henry VIII, now a man broken by both physical ailment and perceived betrayal, retreated into a shell of bitter isolation. The golden prince of his youth was a distant memory, replaced by a monarch whose temper was as unpredictable as his health. He sat alone in the flickering candlelight, staring at the empty space where Catherine once stood. His advisors moved with hushed footsteps, fearing to wake the sleeping lion of his rage. The king's signature on the death warrants felt like a heavy burden, a permanent stain on his legacy that no amount of prayer or political maneuvering could wash away. Orders were issued to strike Catherine's name from the official records and to remove any symbols of her brief reign. The Tudor rose and the Howard lion, once intertwined in celebration, were chiseled away from stone mantles and scraped from illuminated manuscripts. It was a systematic erasure, an attempt to blot out the memory of the girl who had momentarily brought joy back to the aging king's heart. Yet, the more they tried to delete her existence, the more her absence was felt. The scars left on the palace walls mirrored the scars left on the collective memory of the English people. The Howard family, once the most powerful architects of the Tudor court, found themselves standing on the precipice of ruin. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, desperately sought to distance himself from his niece's treason, writing scathing letters of condemnation to the king to save his own neck. The family's influence, built over generations, crumbled like dry rot. In the dark corners of their estates, hushed conversations were held by candlelight, plotting a survival that seemed increasingly unlikely. The fall of Catherine was not just the death of a queen, but a devastating blow to the Howard dynasty's ambitions. Hidden away in the royal archives, the incriminating letters, the primary evidence of Catherine's secret life, were locked in iron-bound chests. These scraps of paper, filled with youthful passion and reckless promises, became the ghosts of the Tudor era. They were kept not for sentiment, but as a warning of the dangers of female agency and the volatility of the royal bloodline. For centuries, these documents remained dormant, gathering dust in the cold, damp vaults of history, waiting for a future generation to uncover the truth of the girl who was caught in a game she could never hope to win. The Tower of London, the site of Catherine's final hours, remained a grim sentinel over the Thames. Its cold stone walls held the echoes of her prayers and the finality of the axe. To the common people, the tower was a place of terror, a symbol of the king's absolute power. As night fell, the fortress seemed to bleed into the dark sky, its towers looming like giants over the city. The memory of the teenage queen became part of the tower's lore, a story whispered by guards and prisoners alike, contributing to the dark, mystical aura that would define the landmark for centuries. In the annals of history, Catherine Howard is often compared to her cousin, Anne Boleyn. Both were Howard women, both were young, and both met the same violent end on the same green at the Tower. However, while Anne was seen as a political catalyst, Catherine was often dismissed as a mere victim of her own naivety. This comparison overlooks the shared tragedy of their lives, two women used as pawns by their families and discarded by a king who valued his ego over their humanity. Their spirits, bound by blood and fate, haunt the Tudor narrative as a dual warning against the perils of power. As decades passed, the Tudor dynasty gave way to the Stuarts and then the Hanoverians, but the fascination with Catherine Howard never truly faded. Historians began to sift through the fragments of her life, trying to piece together the reality of the girl behind the scandal. Was she a victim, a rebel, or simply a child out of her depth? The serious documentary tone of later centuries sought to reclaim her from the sensationalist gossip of her own time. Through painstaking research, the parchment records finally began to reveal a more nuanced portrait of a young woman who was more than just a footnote in Henry's reign. In 1876, during the restoration of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the remains of the doomed queens were finally identified. Beneath the chancel floor, the bones of Catherine Howard were found, lying near those of Anne Boleyn and Jane Rochford. This physical rediscovery brought a renewed sense of gravity to her story. No longer just a name in a book, She was a person of flesh and bone who had suffered a terrifying end. A memorial marker was placed, finally granting her a measure of the dignity that had been stripped from her on the scaffold over 3 centuries earlier. Today, Catherine Howard is remembered not just for her mistakes, but as a symbol of the tragic intersection between youth and absolute power. Modern perspectives often view her through a lens of empathy, recognizing the impossible situation she was thrust into by her ambitious kin. Her legacy is a flickering light in the dark corridors of British history, a reminder that behind every crown and every scandal is a human heart. As we look back at the doomed teenage queen, we see a reflection of our own fragility and the enduring power of a story that refuses to be forgotten. In the wake of the executioner's final strike, a profound and chilling silence descended upon the Tudor court. The vibrant, chaotic energy Catherine Howard once brought to the halls of Hampton Court evaporated, replaced by an oppressive atmosphere of mourning and unspoken regret. The king's courtiers moved like ghosts through the corridors, their whispers hushed by the weight of what had transpired. Henry himself, once the boisterous protector, retreated into a shell of bitter isolation. The throne room, once a stage for her youthful exuberance, now stood as a cold monument to the fleeting nature of royal favor and the brutal finality of treason. History is often written by the survivors, but the physical remnants of Catherine's life provide a more nuanced narrative. Archival records, once mere administrative tallies, now serve as a haunting testament to her existence. We see the ink-stained scrolls of her trial, the jagged signatures of the men who condemned her, and the inventories of her confiscated jewels. These artifacts are the scars of a political machine that devoured its own children. In the dim light of the archives, these documents pulse with a tragic vitality, reminding us that Catherine was not just a name in a book, but a living, breathing woman caught in a web of power. The Tower Green, where Catherine met her end, remains a place of somber reflection. Centuries have passed, yet the stones seem to hold the memory of that cold February morning. Modern visitors stand where the scaffold once rose, looking out over the gray Thames. There is a peculiar stillness here, a break in the modern city's frantic pace. We look back at the girl who was barely 20, who died for the crimes of her youth and the ambitions of her family. The Green is no longer a place of execution, but a sanctuary for her memory, where the past and present collide in a moment of quiet empathy. As King Henry VIII aged, the specter of Catherine Howard likely haunted his more introspective moments, though he rarely voiced it. He became a man consumed by his own legacy and physical decline, a monarch whose desperate search for a male heir had left a trail of broken lives in its wake. The vibrant court he once led had become a place of fear and suspicion. In the flickering firelight of his private chambers, the memory of his rose without a thorn may have bloomed briefly before being crushed by the weight of his royal prerogative. The king's later years were a study in the loneliness of absolute power. One of the greatest tragedies of Catherine's story is the erasure of her image. Unlike Henry's other wives, no definitive portrait of Catherine Howard is known to have survived. This void in the visual record serves as a powerful metaphor for her lost identity. We are forced to imagine her through the descriptions of others, her grace, her laughter, her supposed beauty. In the absence of a face, Catherine becomes a mirror for our own interpretations. She is the faceless queen, a blank canvas upon which history has projected its prejudices, its scandals, and more recently, its profound sense of sorrow for a life cut short. The symbol of the white rose, which Catherine adopted as her badge, remains a poignant emblem of her reign. In the harsh world of the Tudor court, it was a symbol of purity and innocence that was quickly stained by the blood of politics. We see the rose not as a flourishing flower, but as a bloom caught in a frost, its petals brittle and darkening. It represents the fragility of the Howard family's hopes and the swiftness with which Catherine's fortunes turned. This wilting rose serves as a visual shorthand for her brief, tragic summer as Queen of England, a beauty that was never meant to survive the winter of the king's displeasure. In the modern era, historians have begun to peel back the layers of misogyny and propaganda that defined Catherine's story for centuries. We no longer see her simply as a juvenile delinquent or a wanton queen. Instead, we see a young girl who was a victim of a system that commodified her beauty and exploited her vulnerability. New research into the letters and testimonies of the time reveals a person who was terrified, manipulated, and ultimately abandoned. This shift in perspective is a vital act of justice, allowing Catherine to finally be heard after centuries of being silenced by those who held the pen of history. Legend speaks of the haunted gallery at Hampton Court, where Catherine's spirit is said to run, screaming for mercy from the king who had already turned his back on her. While these are stories for tourists, the psychological reality they represent is very real. The gallery is a space defined by desperation and the sudden loss of safety. It is a visual metaphor for the entrapment Catherine felt as the walls of her own secrets closed in. Whether or not her ghost remains, the memory of her terror is etched into the architecture, a reminder that the halls of power are often built upon the suffering of the powerless. As we conclude the story of Catherine Howard, we are left with a panoramic view of a life that was as brief as it was tumultuous. From the carefree days of the Duchess's household to the dizzying heights of the throne, and finally to the cold stone of the executioner's block, her journey was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The Tower of London stands as the final punctuation mark to her tale, its dark silhouette a constant against the changing sky. Her story is a cautionary tale of ambition, a study in human frailty, and a reminder of the heavy price paid by those who are caught in the gears of absolute power. Catherine Howard, the doomed teenage queen, remains an indelible part of the British royal mystery. Her legacy is not one of conquest or policy, but of human emotion and the enduring power of a story that refuses to stay buried. We remember her as a girl who lived too fast and died too young, a flickering candle in the dark corridors of the Tudor era. As the ink dries on this chapter of history, her image, though lost, re-emerges in our collective consciousness as a symbol of fragility and the desperate need for empathy. Her name remains whispered in the wind that blows through the stones of her final resting place, forever a queen of hearts and shadows.